This video covers centering theory. I'll provide some intuition behind centering theory and then discuss its key rules regarding relationships between sentences. Finally, I'll work through a case example to show how centering theory can be used to determine which of two discourses is more coherent. Centering theory is a model of entity-based coherence. It's based on the idea that at a given point in a discourse, there is always one entity that is being, quote-unquote, centered on. Moreover, the premise of centering theory is that if a discourse continues to center on the same entity in the next sentence, that next sentence is more coherent with the original sentence than an alternative sentence that does not center on the same entity. For example, let's say that we have two text passages, each 4 sentences long. The first one says, Natalie was an assistant professor at UIC. She taught a class there called Natural Language Processing. She enjoyed teaching the class because she liked NLP a lot. She was planning to teach the class once per year. The second text passage instead says, Natalie was an assistant professor at UIC. UIC had a class that she taught called Natural Language Processing. She enjoyed teaching the class because she liked NLP a lot. The plan was that the class would be taught by Natalie once per year. So these two text passages communicate exactly the same information, and in fact the first and third sentences are identical to one another. However, the second and fourth sentences differ from one another in terms of which entity is the most salient. In the first text passage, the entity Natalie remains highly salient throughout the passage, whereas in the second text passage, UIC and the plan are more salient in the second and fourth sentences. We can intuitively agree that the first text passage is more coherent. It just seems easier to read and flows better. Centering theory seeks to encode this notion using a series of rules based on shifts in entity salience. Specifically, centering theory does this by maintaining 2 representations for each utterance, U sub n. One representation, C sub b of U sub n, is what is known as the backward-looking center of U sub n. This means that it retrieves the most salient entity in the discourse after U sub n is processed or read by someone. The other representation, C sub f of U sub n, is what is known as the forward-looking center of U sub n. This is actually a set of the entities that might be the most salient when finding C sub b in future time steps. Centering theory ranks the entities in C sub f based on a variety of contextual factors, such as the grammatical roles of different entities in the sentence and the dependencies between them. The highest ranked entity from C sub f of U sub n is selected as the preferred center, C sub p, for the next sentence. So at this point, for a given pair of utterances U sub n and U sub n plus 1, we have 3 entities of interest. We have the actual C sub b of U sub n plus 1, and we have the actual C sub b of U sub n. Then we have the preferred entity C sub p of U sub n plus 1, which was selected from the ranked set of entities in C sub f of U sub n plus 1. Based on this information, there are 4 possible relationships between utterances U sub n and U sub n plus 1. If C sub b of U sub n plus 1 is equal to C sub b of U sub n, or if C sub b of U sub n is undefined, this means that in U sub n plus 1, the speaker has continued talking about the same entity that was being centered on in U sub n. Moreover, if C sub b of U sub n plus 1 equals C sub p of U sub n plus 1, this means that it is preferred that the speaker continue talking about this entity. So this is a continue transition. On the other hand, if C sub b of U sub n plus 1 is equal to C sub b of U sub n, or if C sub b of U sub n is undefined, but if C sub b of U sub n plus 1 does not equal C sub p of U sub n plus 1, this means that the speaker has continued talking about the same entity, that they are planning to shift to a new entity. This is a retained transition because the most salient entity from U sub n was retained. In the other two relationships, C sub b of U sub n plus 1 does not equal C sub b of U sub n, so the speaker ended up shifting to a new entity. If it was preferred that they switch to this new entity, this is a smooth shift. However, if it was preferred that they remain with the same entity or shift to a different entity, this is a rough shift. Coherent discourses generally have lots of continue transitions and hopefully very few rough shifts. Specifically, the rules of centering theory indicate that continues are preferred to retains, which are preferred to smooth shifts, which are preferred to rough shifts. This follows the intuition from earlier that discourses that continue to center the same entity flow more nicely than those that repeatedly shift around to centering different entities. Centering theory also specifies that entities that have been centered in an utterance should be pronominalized if the backward center for the next utterance is the same, since it may reduce coherence to restate the full proper noun directly. So with those rules in mind, we can revisit our sample text passages from earlier, and we can see what it would look like if we apply the centering theory rules to them. We'll just look at the first two sentences for this case example. So in the first passage, we have Natalie was an assistant professor at UIC. She taught a class there called Natural Language Processing. And in the second passage, we have Natalie was an assistant professor at UIC. UIC had a class that she taught called Natural Language Processing. In the first passage, our possible forward centers for the first utterance are the two entities we've identified in that utterance, Natalie and UIC. Based on some rules behind the scenes, perhaps based on the fact that the subject of this sentence is Natalie, we'll go ahead and select Natalie as the preferred center. We don't have a backward center for the first utterance because it's the first utterance. Our possible forward centers for the second utterance are Natalie, UIC, and class. And once again, our preferred center is Natalie. Our backward center is also Natalie because that was the centered entity for the first utterance. Based on our rules, we see that the backward center for utterance 1 is undefined, and the backward center for utterance 2 is the same as the preferred center for utterance 2. So this means that we have a continue transition. On the other hand, we have a different ranking of forward centers for the second utterance in the second passage, resulting in the preferred center being UIC. This means that the backward center does not match the preferred center for utterance 2. Since the backward center for the first utterance was undefined, we have a retain relation. However, if we were to continue on to the next utterance, where the preferred center would likely be Natalie and the backward center would be UIC, we would have a rough shift. So, we can see that based on the rules from centering theory, the first passage of text is found to be more coherent.